So once again, we have those same definitions that I showed you before. We have a captain of industry and a robber baron. Captain of industry, a business leader whose means of amassing a personal fortune contributes positively to the country in some way. Things like production, they're making a lot of things that they're able to sell. They're expanding the market, shipping things to Canada, shipping things to Mexico, shipping things to Europe. They're creating jobs. They're giving people jobs, helping that large workforce actually get to work and be productive. And there's also philanthropy. They're able to give away a lot of this money through things like the Rockefeller Foundation, through things like founding universities, through helping the common good in a sense. And then on the other side, robber baron, a business leader who uses exploitative practices to amass their wealth. In other words, they control natural resources. If we think of, and we'll get into more of these specifics later, but if I was able to completely control pencil manufacturing, I could charge $1 a pencil rather than 25 cents a pencil or whatever. Accruing high levels of government influence. In this case, we're thinking of examples where they could buy off politicians. So again, I'm going to use the example of the Clinton Foundation. A lot of people think that people would come in and give money to the Clinton Foundation in order to get political favors. Or back at this time, to be a real robber baron, you would literally just give money to politicians in order to get your way. In some cases, robber barons paid low wages. There's definitely something to be said as a positive outcome of today of having something like a minimum wage that keeps robber barons of today from paying way too little for people working a full day. And the last point, squashing competition. And we did this last week and we did it a little bit this week, but through things like what Jay Gould did of running out of business some of those other people, those competitors. So now there are two main examples that I want you to think of. And I specifically worked really hard to create this white and black format because I want you to think of these things as black and white. One is a positive example, which is the captain of industry. One is a negative example, or the robber baron. But they both can be the same person. They both can be two different people. So I'm going to show you two completely different examples. An example of both of these would be Jay Gould, who we see on the right. He is a robber baron. We talked about him last week and a little bit this week. The other example is James J. Hill. He was clearly not a robber baron. Hill built and operated the Great Northern Railroad from Wisconsin and Minnesota in the east all the way to the west to Washington State. Without any federal land grants or subsidies, he carefully planned his railroad's route to pass close to established towns, and he worked really hard to make sure that the people in those towns were benefited by his railroad, by the work he did. Jay Gould, on the other hand, remember he's on the right. Jay Gould was a notoriously corrupt railroad owner. Bribery was not out of his moral question. He built his fortune through swindling investors and taxpayers, bribing officials, cheating on his contracts, and blatantly just not paying the debts that he accrued. So we have these two examples, James J. Hill, a captain of industry, and Jay Gould, a classic robber baron. I'm now going to show you two clips from documentaries done on both of them that really highlight how Jay Gould was a robber baron, and on the other hand, how James J. Hill was a captain of industry.
Known as the Empire Builder, James J. Hill was instrumental in settling the Great Plains. Wielding the vision of a transcontinental railroad, Hill recruited immigrants to settle along his rail lines to create a market for his company. By the end of his life, Hill's economic dominance stretched from his headquarters in St. Paul all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
In the 1890s, all the transcontinentals except the Great Northern went bankrupt in the Panic of 1893. Hill, backed by J.P. Morgan, will get de facto control of the Northern Pacific. They will purchase a controlling interest in the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. All of these lines together, plus some smaller lines, will form the basis of what's about to become the Northern Securities Company. The day Northern Securities is formed, it immediately becomes the largest single railroad organization in the country. So in the rise of big business, this is pretty big stuff. Only U.S. Steel is larger than Northern Securities.
Hill was a force to be reckoned with. He firmly believed that this should all be one humongous entity, one railroad, and that was his dream, and it was the dream of empire. He was a very driven individual. He had a very large house in St. Paul on Summit Avenue, and I think he had that house simply to keep up appearances, because I don't know how often he stayed in that house, because he was busy moving around his system, busy making sure things were happening the way he wanted them to.
He was, I guess, in what we would call in the 21st century, a workaholic. 7 days a week, he was very much on the ground, hands-on, saw in person what happened.
During the late 19th century, industrial robber barons dominated the political and economic landscape of America. These wealthy businessmen used shrewd and sometimes exploitative practices to put their competition out of business, create monopolies, and influence politicians, all while amassing huge fortunes. Jay Gould, an upstate New York native, would become one of the greatest robber barons of his day. Gould had an inauspicious beginning to his infamous career. He studied at Hobart Academy in Delaware County and got his first job as an accountant for a local blacksmith. As a young man, Gould created a map of Delaware County, which can still be studied today at the Delaware County Historical Association in Delhi. Gould began investing his money in small railways in 1859, and by 1868, through stock manipulation, he was eventually able to wrestle control of the Erie Railroad from Cornelius Vanderbilt. By 1881, Gould had the largest railroad empire in the nation, controlling nearly 15% of all rail lines in the United States. Today, he represents one of the most infamous local legends here along New York's path through history.
Once again, we come back to these two main characters. James J. Hill, a captain of industry. If you want to write that on your notes, that would be great. And Jay Gould, a robber baron. So I want you to remember, think about this. These bullet points: production, expansion of markets, jobs, philanthropy under captains of industry, and robber baron, controlling natural resources, accruing high levels of government influence, paying low wages, and completely squashing competition. Big business, making mad stacks, yo. In this section, we're going to be talking about some of the classic industrialists or economic powerhouses or very influential figures that some have argued are robber barons and some have argued are captains of industry. As we go through this, I'm going to be talking about, there's a ton of information here. We're going to be talking about corporations, stocks, selling things, buying things, vertical integration, horizontal integration. So to start with, and I know we've talked about this in class, what is vertical integration, what is horizontal integration, but I'm going to show you a clip from a crash course, economics, so not U.S. history. We don't have to look at John Green or Hank Green, but we do have to talk to these two economists. I think they do a really good job of explaining it, and if I'm completely honest, if I were to explain it, you'd be disappointed in how I explained it, so I'm going to let them explain what is vertical integration and what is horizontal integration.
This is why most economists support antitrust laws that promote competition and outlaw anti-competitive tactics. They're called antitrust laws because monopolies used to be called trusts. In 1890, the U.S. passed the Sherman Act, named for Senator John Sherman. Sherman argued, if we will not endure a king as a political power, we should not endure a king over the production, transportation, and sale of any of the necessaries of life. The Sherman Act outlaws any monopolist monopolization or attempted monopolization. Court rulings and later laws gave the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission greater authority to prevent monopolies. If the Coca-Cola Company wanted to purchase PepsiCo, it'd be a tough regulatory sell. In the U.S., mergers and acquisitions need to be approved by the government agencies. Economists call the act of buying companies that produce similar products horizontal integration. Like AT&T tried to buy T-Mobile, but failed because regulators believed the new company would control too big a share of the wireless communications market. Vertical integration, on the other hand, is when a company directly owns or controls its supply chain. For example, in the 1920s, the Ford Motor Company owned much of the entire supply chain needed to make cars. It owned iron and coal mines, and it made its own steel, glass, tires, and even paper in the massive River Rouge factory complex in Michigan. Vertical integration's complicated, and it's not always illegal. When a company just expands its business to insource part of its supply chain, that's usually not subject to antitrust regulation. Companies can run into some trouble when they try to vertically integrate via mergers. Antitrust regulations can also prevent companies from making anti-competitive deals with their suppliers. In the late 1990s, Microsoft was accused of pressuring PC manufacturers to pre-install Microsoft's web browser, Internet Explorer, and exclude their main browser competitor, Netscape. Regulators busted them and almost busted up the company. Even Toys R Us, it's gotten in trouble for conspiring with toy suppliers like Hasbro and Mattel to stop the manufacturers from selling certain toys to other stores.
So here, I think, is a great image of vertical and horizontal integration. So we have up top fuels, we have transportation, processing, transportation of the raw materials, production of the raw materials. This is horizontal integration. So here we have the processing. So this is what Rockefeller did. He purchased all of the oil refineries. So he was able to completely control this element of processing or refining. And it even says it right there, refining oil into kerosene. Vertical integration is owning everything from the production of the raw materials. So oil is pumped out of the ground. Transportation, how are you going to move the crude oil from where it's being pumped out to your refinery? Then you own the refinery. Then you own transportation once it's refined into gasoline. And then you own the selling of it to the consumer. So Henry Ford did this model where he owned everything from the steel, the rubber, the glass in the windows, every piece, every step of the way Henry Ford owned, and then you're able to cut costs. Apple does a very, very similar thing. Now, Google, on the other hand, is much more of this. They have almost a virtual monopoly on the search engine. Now, we do have Bing, and we have other Yahoo, but we all know that's a joke. Google definitely has the monopoly here, and I think it's interesting to kind of see how vertical and horizontal integration happened, quote unquote, back then, but also is happening today.